much for the invitation. My instructions are to take 25 minutes or so to discuss fundamental questions about the interrelations of context, institution, and knowledge production in the field of exegesis by parsing the study of the Bible by institutional context. And I was invited because the conveners were interested in how I, as a Jewish scholar of the New Testament, working in an interdenominational liberal Christian divinity school, perceive exegetical research taking place in my context. So I shall reflect on such contextualized student production, and I'm using the term production rather than exegetical research, since not all the production at Vanderbilt is either exegesis narrowly defined or research in the sense of engaging with other interpretations, whether professional or popular. And here a nod to Dagara for complicating the meaning of exegesis. For convenience, I divide my remarks into 4 parts. I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll offer a few concluding laments and predictions. The 4 parts, and had I more time, there would have been more parts. The 5th was to have been methodological idolatry, and the 6th, identity politics. So I thank Jeremy for raising the topics. Are 1, the slide from the correct claim that white supremacy is baked into the foundations of Western critical biblical interpretation, 2, by some students, the marginalization and stigmatization of historical critical studies, including textual source and redaction criticism, as developed by and promoting a white Western supremacist agenda that attempts to make universal, such as a worldview that does not include the miraculous or ghosts or spirits, something that is in fact not fact, but construction. This breakdown of historical critical hegemony includes both the move toward a more diverse interpretive community, which is good, and a reinscription of both elitist production and exclusionist judgments, not so good. Second, trauma and triggering and the question of academic safe space. How might we address theological education when our students find themselves unable or unwilling to address certain subjects? And how do we as faculty recognize the distinction between introducing difficult concepts and triggering traumatic or other psychological crises in our students? I teach divinity students who want to go on to become Christian ministers, which is a weird job for a Jew, but somebody's got to do it. Our students cannot serve as clergy without being able to engage in pastoral care with congregants who themselves need to talk about difficult subjects. So is the academy to be delimited as safe space, or is it a place where difficult topics must be addressed, but perhaps addressed differently? Number 3, the inability to recognize, or worse, the manifest denial of anti-Jewish production, whether because of ignorance, expedience, Christian fragility, hard supersessionism, ideological purity, and what might be called comparative or even competitive victimization. And number 4, a new pedagogy that demands facilities outside faculty, a new pedagogy that demands faculty outside particular affinity or identification groups develop tools of critical allyship in working with students who self-locate within those groups in developing topics, approaches, and contributions. So first, on the white supremacist context and the shaping of academic biblical studies. Now, that historical critical readings do not carry the objectivity that their earlier and some present practitioners presume is old news. That many historical arguments remain speculative or neither provable nor disprovable is also old news. Minimalists and maximalists debate whether anything in Israel's scriptures predates the Babylonian exile, or in extreme cases, the rise of Hellenism. We don't know what Jesus said or did in the Jerusalem temple, when he said it or did it, or even that he said it or did it. For students who demand absolute or unquestionable certainty or so-called objectivity, at least for some of my students, the entire historical endeavor is a waste of time. So I have to make an apology for it. More, historical critical work, since it assumes institutionally authorized professional development, is by definition elitist. And for some of my students, what is elitist should be erased. They're usually not, however, aware of the elitism of this conclusion, which they began to promote after taking a couple of university courses. And I note here the situation in the liberal Protestant divinity school in the US is the opposite of what Anya talked about for the German context. We here do not require either Hebrew or Greek knowledge, but to read a text without concern for its original language or the reliability of the translation, historical context, or reception history, to interpret by asking only, what does this text mean to me? Well, it does equalize the professional and the lay reader. It can create partnership and relationship rather than hierarchy in both the classroom and a church. Such an approach, which is a fine place to start, empowers the non-professional even as it honors personal experience. This non-professional approach can also stimulate new and good questions. This is the approach that guided the famous liberation theological work, The Gospel of Salentinami. On US soil, earlier non-historical critical approaches, including canonical criticism and typology, proved helpful for abolitionist arguments. The ahistorical approach guides readings that my insider students produce at Riverbend Maximum Security Institute, the prison where Tennessee's death row is located, and where I bring divinity students to meet with insider students to read gospel. My students at Riverbend are, on the whole, less interested in source and text criticism, Greek or Hebrew, than what the Bible, and usually the King James Version, says about eternal life, forgiveness of sins, and divine love. It is the responsibility of the academic interpreter to remember that the Bible is not just an historical document. It needs to continue to speak to the people who hold it sacred. And if the resulting reading is a repetition of what has been said before, no matter, because who would know? And if it's historically inaccurate, no matter, because who would care? So I'm not ready to toss out historical critical work, and neither are many of my other students. Here's the problem. Today, the distrust of historical critical work for being tainted by bias, and I should also note, by the way, that you can be biased and right, for lacking provable conclusions and elitist, is in some pockets of the academy complemented by a fourth approach, the idea that historical critical work should be dismissed as a white male, cisgendered, heterosexual, bourgeois, Western Enlightenment endeavor designed to respond to white masculinist, cisgendered, heterosexist, bourgeois hegemonic interests, whether controlling the historical narrative by marginalizing other readings and so other perspectives, or by seeking a pure origin, and Hindy's already addressed that issue of the pure origin, or recovering the story of the great man, Moses, Jesus, whoever, rather than the people, the poor, the women, the ethnic and sexual others, and so on. So the result is that in various pockets of biblical studies, the historical critical enterprise and any who might want to ask questions of history must be put under erasure or canceled for their supremacist origins, presupposition, interests, and results. Ironically, in the academy, then one elitist model replaces another, because that's what academics does. New approaches and perspectives are readily found in cultural studies, ethnic studies, gender studies, disability studies, and so on. And such new social location-based studies have much to contribute to biblical interpretation. In the textbook I co-authored with Warren Carter, The New Testament Methods and Meanings, each chapter introduces both the historical context of a biblical book as best as we can determine it, and then shows how different reading strategies can open up different interpretations, because the answers one gets substantially depend on the questions one asked. As well, the dismissal of history and historicization runs contrary to the very multicultural and post-colonial ideas, as well as many of these other approaches, that its promoters want to celebrate, or at least they want to celebrate some cultures. Once the historical context vanishes, we lose, for example, the influence of Egyptian, Canaanite, and Persian culture on the construction of ancient Israel. It's historical critical work that gets us to the Babylonian context of Genesis 1 and the Galilean and Judean context of Jesus, the broader Roman context of Paul and the people to whom he wrote. So we can recover queer history and women's history and the history of the disabled and so on. Indeed, to read the text only through presentist lenses is to colonize the text, even as it dismisses, ironically, the text critical work that was not invented in Germany. Philo and his buddies are already doing it in first century Alexandria. It dismisses the Masoretes, and it dismisses the people burned at the stake for translating the Bible into the vernacular. Not all historical critical work developed auf Deutsch. As for theology, once the historical context vanishes, Jesus becomes depicted as the one unique individual devoted to healthcare, women's rights, or speaking truth to power. That unique categorization gives Christology a new theological valence. Jesus' divinity, his uniqueness, is based not in his incarnation or his resurrection, but in his complete distinction from his Jewish context. And that context An imagined apocalyptically negative blasphemy that needs to be replaced or eliminated is then easily mapped onto one's own context, with the America of Donald Trump being a standard context, but any colonial context would do, with Jesus serving as the liberationist, countercultural, subversive response. And since Judaism becomes the source of evil, it cannot be improved. It can only be transformed or eliminated. This denial of history works for both self-identified Christians committed to economic reform, the dismantling of late global capitalism and racial justice, and self-identified Christians who would deny rights to same-sex couples and to trans students having to urinate in the public schools, and who would forbid abortion but would restore prayer in the name of Jesus to the public school system, because an ahistorical Jesus is a very malleable Jesus. Another problem for ahistorical biblical studies is a moral elitism that condemns some approaches, such as source criticism, as products of white supremacy and therefore as illegitimate. An approach that dismisses rather than engages questions is not, in my view, helpful. One that stigmatizes the person who asks such questions as complicit in white supremacy is less helpful. In fact, I think it's harmful. Such an approach returns, ironically, to a pre-modern fundamentalism in which some questions should not be asked. The shift toward presentist and the critical theoretical approaches complicates assessment of the product. An autobiographical product, or one that begins, "The Holy Spirit told me," and yes, in class, I still get that occasionally. I advise the students to go to the library to give the Spirit something to work with, is more difficult to assess, since it is based not in a text or an ancient context or engagement with other readers, but in the experiences of the author. Such production can become an elegant form of solipsism. My interpretation is correct because I say it's correct, or a variant is correct for me, and that's all that matters. There may be challenges or critique possible from someone of the same social location or subject position, or perhaps from someone from a position subaltern to the author, but critique from above, from a tenured faculty member, or even from a graduate student assistant in a non-minoritized or less minoritized subject position, can be more readily rejected as stemming not from an understanding of the text, but from a misunderstanding at best of the producer's context. I would like to move production of this sort from show and tell, which is a good thing, but not for me enough, to what do we learn from this production about the text, and not just about the reader, and not just about the method. Historical critical methods generated and continue to generate their own sort of questions as having self-evident value. But historical critical work cannot solve present-day problems, although it can start by making us aware of them and helping us think through them. Presentist approaches, especially those that begin with the answers to current social issues, to beg the question in its proper idiomatic sense, that is, they generate their assumed answers. What needs to be done is to restore the interrogative aspect of those presentist questions, and then, if the rationale for the study is to get some message to speak today, have the new questions guide historical critical methods and thereby transform the possible resulting interpretations. Where is God in all of this? For some readers, the source of revelation is less in the Bible or the Bible than it is the theory-driven method, post-colonial readings, disability studies, trauma studies, and so on. And this is pretty sketchy theology, since in 5 years we'll still have the Bible, but the methods will have changed. More, if God is in the theory, then we have a fundamentalist God that is timeless, universal, and generally boring. For others, God is in the encounter between the text and the individual, so there's little reason for what we might call exegetical work. The production is personal and experiential, and it is not open to critique. Finally, with this type of personal reading, there are not 2 or 3 gathered in the name of anyone because it's all done quite individually. Such interpretive production may be informed by other readings, but it is ultimately an individual rather than a communal endeavor. Moving on to trigger warnings and safe space. When I teach biblical material with violent context, and much of it is negative stereotypes, depictions of suicide, or anything else that might trigger a student, I provide them warnings. I have had students leave the classroom prior to discussion because they feared being triggered or traumatized by the rape narratives in Genesis 34, Judges 19, and 2 Samuel 12, by depictions of slavery from Hagar to Bilhah and Zilpah to the Israelites Israelites to Jesus' parables that have slaves to instructions in the New Testament epistolary household codes. They might be traumatized by Romans 1 on same-sex relations, by Ephesians 5 or 1 2 on women's subordination, by the dismemberment of the so-called Whore of Babylon, and so on. I'm wondering if I can keep the students in the classroom. Surprisingly, I have encountered no one who found the crucifixion of Jesus traumatic, which may be a theological point. You are welcome to make suggestions. I did, by the way, teach one undergraduate student who, after reading the Gospel of Mark, came to my office in tears saying, "He died. I didn't think he was going to die." Such is biblical illiteracy in the United States. So where are we in the classroom? Not only do we have to watch out for the mental health of our students, we have to be aware that our own comments and even our assignments can be traumatizing, and I'm using the language of trauma generously. Today, we must consider how we present material. In PowerPoints, for example, about the so-called curse of Ham, do we show illustrations that dehumanize people of African descent to show how bigotry became normalized, or do we refrain from doing so lest we harm or simply discomfort the student? Can we quote from biblical historians of past generations who use terms that are now under erasure, and so I shall not use them here? Or do we find less triggering terms and bowdlerize the quote? Do we cite commentary that negatively categorizes women, such as Tertullian's "You are the devil's gateway"? Are our texts and slides and lectures pornographic, educational, or both? Next. There's a push in some sectors of the academy to set up safe space for students, classrooms where all views will be respected, excuse me, except those that may demean others in the class. But at least in my experience, the SNTS, the SBL, the CBA, the AJS, and other professional societies are not safe space. I do not know if this conference is. So far it seems so. I'm hoping that will continue. Or if on the whole theologians are just nicer or more thick-skinned than biblicists. We make our living as academics in part by building on the work of others, even while showing how that earlier work was at best prescient or incomplete or sometimes a negative foil. Biblical studies might do better were non-agonistic. We can phrase our comments in more gracious ways, but should we consider our classrooms and our publications to be safe space? For theology, we can argue that God is on the side of the oppressed, but to take the divine as acting out of trauma strikes me as a bit much. Then again, on my campus at Vanderbilt Divinity School, theology tends to be constructive rather than historical or systematic, and the intro course entitled Foundations in Theological Education has the Bible going not only unread, but unmentioned. Some faculty have proposed making biblical studies optional for a divinity degree. So if the Bible is necessary for theology, theologians will have to make the case for its inclusion, and they will also have to determine what forms of biblical interpretation, as well as what passages from the Bible, they would find necessary for theological work. Finally, theologians will have to determine how the Western view of biblical interpretation minus the supernatural fits in with theological questions. It may be that the theologian and the biblical, or at least historical critical biblical scholar, are climbing different mountains or chasing rabbits down different holes. Third, the denial of anti-Jewish readings. Ahistorical approaches coupled with issues of trauma and triggering find a complement in the biblical studies classroom and beyond in both Christian privilege and Christian fragility. For centuries, normative Christian biblical interpretation made Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus look good. Prior to Enlightenment readings, Jews were children of the devil and Jesus was the only begotten Son of the Father. So not much effort was needed in negatively categorizing Jews and Judaism or separating Jesus from them. But with the rise of critical biblical scholarship and its attendant demythologization, that negative categorization of Judaism increased. Without the supernatural elements, the risk is that Jesus will appear to be a failed Messiah who did not bring about the Messianic age and who did not cause us all to turn our swords into plowshares. Thus, for example, my students continue to repeat comments such as, Jews represent retributive justice of an eye for an eye, while Jesus teaches the distributive justice of turning the other cheek. Missing here is not only the rabbinic insistence that the law is not a literal order of punishment, but a legal principle mandating some compensation in cases of physical injury, but also the rhetorical situation of Jesus' teaching. To move from losing an eye to a backhanded slap across the cheek is to change it. Or they insist that the Pharisees, as Jesus' antipode, taught that wealth equals righteousness and poverty equals sin. They did not, while Jesus invents good news for the poor. When I suggest that they are replacing history with stereotype or fantasy, or worse, that their conclusions reproduce spate Judentum, which Hindi has already mentioned, the view of a decadent Second Temple Judaism as dead end, found in the exegetical ancestors of Wellhausen, Bousset, Harnack, and so on, my students react with denial. They cannot possibly have made anti-Jewish comments. The denial comes from several sources. For many, the problem is often based on ignorance, since seminary training, until they get to me, does not include instruction on Second Temple Judaism or Jewish understandings of, to use the Christian term, Old Testament. Such ignorance, by the way, also hampers rabbis who make erroneous and negative statements about Christianity. Along with ignorance, expedience promotes anti-Jewish teaching. It's easier to tell a congregation how not to be like bad Jews than to prod them into opening their wallets or visiting people in prison. It's easier to allow a potentially anti-Jewish New Testament passage to be proclaimed from the lectionary than it is to do the hard work of revising the lectionary, or for church groups to provide homilist guidelines on what to say or not say, lest they inculcate or reinforce anti-Jewish views. Third, some of my students engage in what might be called comparative or competitive victimization. This approach argues, for example, that because more people were killed in the Middle Passage, that's the route ships carrying enslaved individuals took between Africa and the US colonies, later states, there's no reason to spend time talking about anti-Jewish exegesis when we need to attend to racist readings. A variant of this view, which divides the world into those with power and those without, is the claim that a member of a minoritized group cannot be anti-Jewish because to be so is to have power, but it's the Jews who have power. The most recent US example of this view surfaced last week, at least in terms of minoritized individuals not being bigots. This played out in the New York Times. A woman who accused a Black teenager of stealing her cell phone, it was later found and returned by an Uber driver, stated in an interview that, quote, she could not be a racist because she is a woman of color. She is of Puerto Rican and Vietnamese descent. So when I ask my students if they believe that all people who self-identify or are identified as white harbor some racist views or are in fact racist, the majority, if not all, respond in the affirmative. Of course you are. When I ask them if all Christians harbor some anti-Jewish views or are in fact anti-Jewish, some respond that the question is not legitimate, is designed to hurt them, or is not applicable to students who are minoritized, and others stop and think about it. A fourth reason such historically ignorant and theologically abhorrent preaching continues is Christian fragility. And here I am following Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility. Namely, I get excuses like, well, I didn't mean all Jews, or surely some Jews were lovers of money, or the problem is not Jew hatred, but Islamophobia and transphobia and so on. At times, interpreters will acknowledge text as problematic. Oh, this is a difficult text, and then proceed with whatever else is on their agenda. Such approaches classify one, to use the English term, woke, but they leave intact the problem. The result is that the student is satisfied even as the anti-Jewish text or impression remains in place. This move of acknowledgement and then moving on would not, I suspect, be accepted in US context were the text or comment to be perceived as anti-Black or homophobic. The response grounded in fragility is related to a response grounded in privilege. Because some Christian students do not recognize their own privilege as being part of the Christian majority, they cannot hear how their comments sound in others' ears. For example, some students insist that Christianity is better than Judaism because it eschews an ethnocentric focus. The claim, by the way, ignores the church ethnos connection of countries with an ethnic majority and a cross on the flag, and celebrates the universal rather than the particular. Only the majority would find the erasure of difference to be a benefit. The fact that Christianity proclaims salvation only through the Christ and therefore has soteriological particularism is ignored. To universalize in this sense is to colonize or to supersede and abject. A potential fifth reason for the denial of anti-Judaism, and I ask this as a question rather than stated as a fact, does the rejection of historical criticism by Christian readers seeking only a message for today function as another form of unaware or unacknowledged anti-Judaism, because it's Jewish history that gets erased, even as Jesus becomes the representative of the particular minoritized group under discussion? Defensiveness emerges when the colonized start to claim their own histories and their own narrative, and we can track this matter in studies of Paul. Decades ago, some interpreters rejected the so-called new perspective on Paul because it did not begin from the presupposition that the problem that motivated Paul was Jewish works righteousness. Today, the new iteration of this debate concerns the Paul within Judaism school, also known as the radical new perspective. In this configuration, the new perspective did not go far enough in that it still found Paul's problem to be with Jews and Judaism, whether ethnocentrism or pride in having followed Torah or boasting in circumcision. The Paul within Judaism school changes the question. Since Paul sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles, and since he's writing to Gentile congregations, his problem is not with Judaism, it's with Gentiles in the Messianic community. The change in focus then explains what may appear to be statements dismissing of the Torah. The statements are not anti-Jewish. They are rather arguments that the mitzvot, the commandments designed to keep Jews distinct, were written for Jews, not for Gentiles. So let's begin with the premise that for Paul, the problem is not works righteousness, and it's not the inability to follow Torah, and it's got nothing to do with the practice of Judaism. The task of the Christian theologian now is to figure out how to incorporate a functional, robust Judaism into its universalizing message. On this matter, the model of what David Novak calls soft supersessionism seems to me to be most faithful to the New Testament. Either everyone is saved through the faith of Christ, subjective genitive, please, or everyone is not. For the Christian theologian, the question remains, how does one avoid a colonizing or triumphalist proclamation and at the same time hold on to any sort of Christology? And is it the case that anti-Judaism is embedded within the fabric of Christianity? But these are questions many of my students do not want to address. They cannot fathom that there might be anti-Jewish rot at the center of their tradition, although they have no difficulty seeing in the Bible sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, and so on. Historians can only do so much here because we don't have enough details to know what Paul intended or how Paul's audience received those texts and so on. Plus, there's always slippage between what one says, even if we had the text, and how another person hears. The same problems hold for research on the quote unquote historical Jesus. We don't know who wrote the Gospels, for whom, when, or where, and we don't have original texts. We don't have sufficient information to determine what Jesus said, let alone what he meant, what got lost in translation, or what got attributed to him for others, and so on. Nor can we define anti-Judaism because we don't agree on what it means. So it will not be the historian, it will be the Christian theologian and ethicist and liturgist who needs to be sure that anti-Jewish takeaways are not perpetuated in biblical reading. It might help here to have Jews on seminary faculties, although in some seminary contexts, this is impossible because the Jew can't sign a faith statement. I am retiring from Vanderbilt next month. In academic year 2021-22, there will be no Jews on the Divinity School faculty. Some of my Vanderbilt students had never met a Jew before they met me. I tell them all Jews know as much about the New Testament as I do. Some students perhaps never will meet a Jew. Would they notice or would they care? And so to the fourth subject, pedagogy. That people who self-identify as men can do feminist analysis without engaging in mansplaining is no longer much of an issue, but questions of who has the authority to speak remain. Can women who code as white do womanist interpretation? Can people who are cisgendered do trans readings? Teaching in a non-denominational Christian divinity school, I do well to have some fluency in the histories, theologies, and liturgies of various Christian traditions. I'm almost a native speaker of Roman Catholicism, have 2 degrees from a Methodist school, and for 9 years taught at a Quaker college. And for the past 27 at Vanderbilt, I've been studying the other traditions. And thus I can help my students know the reception history of a biblical text in their own tradition, and then help them find their own voice within their own ecclesial context. I suspect this concern for religious fluency applies mutatis mutandis to social location-based interpretation. whether the lesbian critical work I first encountered as an undergraduate, work that, by the way, has been substantially replaced or co-opted by the academic fascination with masculinity, womanist or trans reading from the perspective of autism or being confined to a wheelchair, or whatever those social location-based readings are. My task as faculty is to be an ally, to ask questions and make suggestions that can sharpen or enhance an argument, and then to get out of the way. Care must be taken so that in making suggestions, I am not imposing my authority over the student. To be a good ally requires not only the obvious moves of listening, of supporting, of checking privilege. It means in biblical studies to read more widely in theory, autobiography, sociology, psychology, and history. It means to be up on the vocabulary, as terms that were of popular discourse 10 years ago may today be irrelevant or meaningless or even offensive tomorrow. It means to be willing to accept as well as to give critique, and it means to be sympathetic without being co-optative. I can read Matthew like a Lutheran or a Roman Catholic because I know the text and its interpretive tradition. I do not have to believe that Jesus rose from the dead in order to read the gospel from the perspective that Matthew thought he did. At times, my students say I sound more Christian than their pastors, which may or may not be a compliment to me or an insult to them. In other words, I can pass. So, I do not code as a lesbian, but I can read a text from a lesbian lens. What is the role of a sympathetic outsider who wants to support a transgender reading or a reading from a disability status? When do we contribute an article, and when do we step aside to give more space to people from marginalized or underrepresented academic communities? What is the extent that we can offer critique, given that we are coming from a position of privilege? And what parts of our privilege do we not yet recognize? How do we speak? And when do we just shut up? The same questions hold in theology. How does one speak of the disabled God, the trans God, the ethnically coded, albeit of course universal God? And if the focus is on Jesus, does his Jewish identity matter or not? How about his masculine identity? Do we dismiss it? Do we dismiss them? Do we begin with the view that Jesus as a Jew is other, and so develop a theology based on his otherness? And here I'm thinking of the recent work of Barbara Meyer. Do we take the minoritized view to have the moral high ground, or find it simply to be one view of many? Concluding remarks. There was a time, or perhaps I am engaging in fanciful nostalgia because I am old, when we could presume that in biblical studies, we all read the same books and we played on the same field with the same rules. Rookies, women, Jews, people of color, we all still played the game when we were allowed on the field in the first place, but we had different strategies for scoring goals and for avoiding penalties. Today in biblical studies, we are playing on different fields with different rules, ends, and even spectators. I really like my students, or at least most of them. I applaud their enthusiasm, their generally robust sense of self, the curiosity they have for new forms of discourse, their embrace of new rhetorical forms and self-descriptions that grant them new forms of agency. I also worry about my students, lest their view of theology be so tied to social justice that 10 years from now, when the kingdom of God is probably still not in place, they'll echo the refrain, God is dead. I worry that they will become the purveyors or facilitators of Jew hatred, although I think that's more likely to result from students who did not work with me or other divinity school and seminary faculty who attend to matters of anti-Judaism. And I worry about theological education, which is threatening to become as insulated as affinity and identity group SBL sessions. The homes Jeremy discussed threaten to become gated communities. The move across history is separation rather than confederation, to denominationalism rather than to Catholicism. Leviticus mandates both love of neighbor, one of us, and one of stranger, one of them. How do we honor the stranger and still hold on to our theological beliefs and exegetical conclusions, which is what humanity should do? And finally, how do we put biblical studies in conversation with theology, or do we go our separate ways in our separate silos, as much of the rest of the academy and the nation states are still doing? These are real questions. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to raise them with you. Thank you.